Over the last several decades, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of different management techniques that have been developed by consultants to help organizations improve. Unfortunately, this has caused a lot of confusion among clients, and as a result, many things are force-fit into companies where it really would not apply. In many cases, it's often trying to force a square peg into a round hole. One way of dealing with this mass confusion is to give you a framework in terms of when to use all these different techniques, and then also what guidelines on what decisions up front you should be making to make clear organizational changes as time goes on. When considering organizational change, we have come up with a framework that will allow you to implement whatever kind of organizational change is necessary, whether it be large scale or small scale. Regardless of the size of the organization, regardless of the scope of what you want to accomplish, these are the steps that you should do in sequence to accomplish this. The first set of steps has to do with what we call the framework questions. Things like forming a steering committee, who's going to be conducting the initial assessment of the organization, the scope of change involved, so on and so on. And we'll elaborate more on more of these aspects in just a few moments and in just a few slides. After some of these framework questions have been decided, we then need to decide in terms of what we call the level questions. And there are 4 broad levels of organizational change. One has to do with changing and anticipating the future, what we call level 1 change. Level 2 change is where you deal with the strengths and weaknesses of an organization and its core competencies, what some people would call strategic planning. Level 3 changes involve major organizational changes to internal business processes. And level 4 changes involve incremental changes to organizational processes. After these decisions have been made, then the organization needs to define its goals, needs to define the strategies and methods to accomplish these goals, needs to then decide in terms of what measure and measurement systems they wish to use to know that they have accomplished these goals. And lastly, not leastly, define and develop and implement the implementation plan. There may be a number of other aspects and actions that may need to be done in addition to this sequence. It's rather hard to define exactly when you should do these, but these are just some of the things that need to be kept in mind. There may need to be additional assessments made, such as employee surveys. There may need to be additional teamwork and consensus building activities. And there almost for certain will be some kind of training and learning activities. But when these particular ones occur, that's kind of hard to define up front. That will certainly be done as part of the implementation plan. Some of these framework decisions include forming a steering committee, conducting an initial assessment, deciding on the scope of change, that is what we call the levels of organizational change, what kind of initial information should be gathered, answering questions about how and with whom consensus should be made, how implementation should be ensured, and how do we evaluate in terms of the success of the organizational change efforts. One of the most important questions a steering committee must make is what broad set of techniques they are willing to use to change the organization. Organizational change techniques are into 4 broad categories, as we had mentioned before. The first one, called Level 1, is shaping and anticipating the future. That is, looking out into the future and, based upon that, possibly significantly changing what the organization does in that particular environment. Level 2 is defining what particular businesses that they will be in. This basically has to do with things like core competencies and the like. Level 3 are basically assuming that the future will be like the past and that the overall mission of the organization and its core competencies will stay the same. But you are still looking at making significant internal system changes to the organization. Level 4 techniques involve making minor incremental changes to the organization, such as the implementation of Six Sigma. There is nothing wrong or better about one level than another. It needs to be appropriately fitted to the organization. However, you must really take into account a couple of different factors. that the closer to level 1 that you get, the greater risk that the organization is taking and is willing to take. On the other hand, also, it will also involve greater amount of change. So if you potentially are looking at radically changed features from what is occurring now, you may need to really change in terms of what your organization stands for and the different systems and processes that are necessary to make it successful. On the other hand, if you are willing to assume that things are not going to be changing very much and that you are really willing to be making only small incremental changes to what actually you are doing at the time, then that's where level 4 techniques come into play. Other considerations about choosing which level you wish to use include how much risk you're willing to take, how much change from current conditions is needed, how much change you're willing to do, and the degree of consensus and amount of power that you have. The larger the difference between the future and now, the more change must happen. Think of the process as a circle, not a line. If you wish short-term results, you very well might want to use level 4 techniques, that is incrementally in changing your organization's processes. Ultimately, though, that if you wish your organization to change and survive in a very different kind of future, level 1 techniques may be necessary. What particular level is going to be appropriate for your situation is the basis for which you need to do your initial assessment by the steering committee. Let's look at in more detail these different levels of organizational change, starting with level 1, otherwise known as scenario planning. Scenario planning is the development of plans based upon possible future events. These involve developing stories and scenarios based upon trends, creating action plans based upon these stories or scenarios, periodically reviewing these scenarios to see which ones are coming true, and acting accordingly. Level 2 techniques, on the other hand, involve defining your business. It usually involves defining and creating your core competencies, analyzing the SWOT of your company, that is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, as well as the development of your mission. Please also realize that depending upon what particular scenario plays out, what your core competencies are and will be, and what they also need to be, may change significantly. Level 3 and Level 4 techniques, on the other hand, involve making changes to your internal processes. Level 3 kind of changes involve major and significant restructuring to your organization, either in terms of the organizational structure, time paying to measurements, putting added dollars and people into your efforts, adding or changing customers or products, redesigning processes, and revamping IT. Level 4 changes, on the other hand, involve things like motivational speeches, problem-solving teams, displaying graphs and charts on bulletin boards and SharePoint sites, as well as the implementation of Six Sigma. How severe and widespread the problems are suggests what level of change to use. As you see on the accompanying graph, the extent of the problem and the severity of the problem will give you suggestions about what kind of change is necessary. If you're talking about a problem that only affects 1 or 2 people, and severity of which is relatively low, you very well might be doing some little bit of hiring, a little bit of training, a little bit of 360, and a little bit of feedback. On the other hand, that if you are talking about problems that are affecting the entire organization and really are causing a lot of heartburn for a lot of people, that implies that you want to be using multiple systems, whole organizational changes. And as you can see, to some extent, level 4 changes and level 3 changes overlap, but you can take a close look at this and identify where your particular organization is along these continua. It also helps to be doing the assessment that we talked about with your steering committee, so to give you a better calibration as far as what type of change here is necessary to do. Goals, strategies, and methods need to be discussed and defined regardless of what level of organizational change your organization is contemplating. Goals can be fairly broad, such as we want to increase market share by 20%, or that we want to be moving into a new country or new domain, or improving operational efficiency. Strategies you can think about as the tasks that you need to be getting to your goals, and the methods involved are the more detailed steps you need to achieve each strategy. So, in one aspect, you can really think about this as a hierarchy. So, the goals are rather broad, the strategies define how you get to those goals to some detail, and the methods are the more detailed steps that you use to be accomplishing each strategy. As many of you are already aware, there is a problem with using just one measure of success. Using only airspeed to control a plane, for example, will allow you to get there on time, but where the it you go to, that's going to be a good question. You really have to think about using multiple measures of success. You also need to think about not only in terms of how you define the measures of success for each of your goals, but the larger, broader question about how organizational performance should be measured. One way of creating multiple measures of success for an organization is to use what's called the balanced scorecard. The balanced scorecard has four parts to its measurement system. The first part are what you might want to call the traditional financial measures, such as return on investment, return on equity, operating expenses, gross and net profit, unit costs, and the like. On the other hand, you need somewhat longer perspective because you need to be looking at things like customer satisfaction, customer retention, customer growth as far as increased sales per customer, for example. Said you need to be keeping track of at least both of these things, as financial measures of success usually are at the end of all of your efforts, and you have no clear-up indicator as far as what you might be getting in the short and the long term to improve and continue to get your financial success. In addition to financial and customer measures, there are also HR systems and development methods. They include HR systems, training, culture, and change management. That is how you actually deal with your people and develop your people and put the systems in place around you people to encourage them to be working hard and working well. Lastly, and not leastly, you also need to be talking about internal business processes. These are such things as efficiencies, procedures, cycle time, quality, those kind of measures of operational efficiency that are also very important. I mean, it's wonderful if you have great customers, it's wonderful if you have great people, but if you waste a whole lot of time and money getting there, you're not going to be a successful company in the long run. Implementation of organizational change means identifying stakeholders, changing organizational structure, information systems, employee selection, compensation, and performance appraisal systems, and dealing with the emotional aspects of change. Unfortunately, many organizations ignore everything but the last particular component dealing with the emotional aspects when they think about organizational change. One key to organizational change is the development of a SMART plan. Many of you have already heard of a SMART plan, but for those of you who have not, SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Some examples are below. One thing, however, that does tend to be a problem when you develop a SMART plan is that very often it is very, very specifically tied to an exact organizational change or to the implementation of a specific system. And the SMART plan, on the other hand, for successful organizational change, needs to be including other factors. Some other examples of SMART plans are below. Please also note that those other factors that I mentioned are quite important whenever you implement organizational change. They include such things as personnel assignments, budget assignments, sequence of implementation, those aspects that have to do with organizational structure, performance and reward systems, measurement systems, so forth, and so on. One of the things one must really understand when one is doing organizational change is that it's simply just not the implementation of a particular change or activity. It is thinking about the systems that are necessary to be making the changes for the ultimate successful organization to occur. The keys to creating SMART plans, that is, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound plans, are what we call the equation for success. Success is a function of many different components. one of which is measurement. Are you actually measuring what you need to measure? Secondly, what kind of technique or method are you using? If you're using a fire hose to stop a little fire, that's not going to be doing you much good. On the other hand, using a fire hose when you really should be using a toothpick is not exactly a very good technique either. In addition, alignment of systems is also important, as well as making sure that what you attempt to do, you actually have full control over. Focused persistence, that is good planning, helps tremendously, and developing a consensus is also very important. These factors can to some extent compensate for each other, but all must exist to one extent or another to make success happen. In our previous slides, we've already talked about measurement as well as the levels questions, that is what kind of management and techniques that you need to be using to accomplish organizational change. Here, I want to give you some more detail about control. One of the most important things is to make sure that what you can control is in line with what you actually want to achieve. If things are fully in your control and who is affected is only inside your organization, that's great. That way you can deal with the full consequences of whatever you decide to do. On the other hand, you can have circumstances where you have control of events and circumstances that where other people are the victim, if you will, and that also has to be taken into account. Also, you have to take into account the consequences to others. That is, those things that are within your control that are outside of the organization. And lastly, and almost not leastly, is that you have the don't care and the wasted effort categories. Those things that are outside of your control and that no one you know is affected, so frankly, you don't care. You also may have the circumstance where you have full control over things where no one is really affected. And as a result, you may actually put in a considerable wasted effort in terms of what you're trying to achieve. For successful organizational change, you need to focus on type 1 and type 2 actions, that is, those things that are under your control. You need to attempt to compensate for type 3 actions, that is, those things that you cannot control but you are affected by them. And hopefully by that particular point in time, then you can actually start aligning things within your organization. You need to remember, as far as alignment is concerned, that the greater alignment between the plan of action, organizational systems, the organizational changes that you make, and the business situations and goals, the more successful that you will be. Other factors in the equation for success include involvement by stakeholders and a good plan. Involvement by stakeholders is critical not only at the end stage after you've already decided what change to make, but also as part of planning and the implementation of action. At the very least, you should be getting feedback from your stakeholders and deal with their particular emotions and their insecurities. These particular stakeholders might not only involve employees, but customers and suppliers, as well as the management hierarchy itself. In regards to a good plan, there needs to be specific tasks, specific assignments, beginning and end dates, sufficient resources, and periodic evaluation to make sure the progress is properly being made. If this sounds like good project management, you're exactly right. That is exactly what it is. And if you can actually create a Gantt chart in regards to your particular implementation plan with assignments and specific tasks and progress bars and the like, you're definitely one step ahead of most people in regards to what changes are made.